Hey, Coach Bot here. I'm here to talk to you about the in-season strength and conditioning program with the Wrestler's Edge. So in-season training is also called the competitive season. So typically for high school and varsity athletes, that's a period of time, usually during the late fall and winter months where you're competing, weekend after weekend. If you're an international level athlete, then usually this time is sort of summer into fall where there's a large chunk of competitions, and that would be considered your competitive season. That typical varsity schedule, so that high school or college schedule, typically runs from the middle of October until the end of March, and tournaments can also run well into the spring and summer. So essentially, as long as you are competing frequently or weekly, you are considered in season. If you're competing monthly or every other month, I would consider that to be more your off season. So what are the goals for the in-season program? Well, first of all, I'm going to keep the intensity of wrestling specific strength and conditioning exercises and drills really high, but the volume, so how much work you're actually doing, really low. Why is that? Well, in-season injuries are almost always the result of improper load management and lack of strength. So essentially, athletes doing too much volume, too long of workouts without a sufficient enough training stress, and then they end up with overuse injuries. Let's talk about the in-season program and its features. So we want to keep this in mind though, that the in-season program is set up by all the previous training programs and phases. You can't really start a training program or an off-mat training program during your wrestling season. You can expect either to make huge improvements in season when you didn't do anything to prepare yourself up to this point. So I'm going to assume that you've done something in your off season and in the preseason to get yourself ready for your wrestling season. The program features a lower volume training protocol. So what I mean by this is less repetitions per set and less days of lifting. Essentially, only one intensive session per week will maintain your strength that you've gained in the off-season and preseason. Other program features include high intensity prescription for your primary lifts. So now your primary lifts are your Olympic lifts or your power cleans and your hang power cleans or your shrug pulls, and then also your squats and your deadlifts, and maybe even your presses. All of those lifts will continue to be heavy and intense, so that way you can maintain the strength that you've earned in your off season. Why is that? Well, less soreness, believe it or not, because as you go heavier, you're not doing as much volume. There's going to be less residual fatigue. If you're doing sets of 10, 15 repetition, it's actually going to create a lot more fatigue on your muscles than it would be if you're doing less repetitions with heavier weight. This means you've got fresh legs for practice and for matches. It's also a legendary myth that athletes will become bigger from high intensity lifting and will have trouble cutting weight. In fact, if you do higher intensity lifts, so heavier lifts with less volume, you will continue to get stronger, but you will not put on muscle mass. It's not the recipe for that. Other features include that it's not an in-season maintenance program. The magic actually lies in how I've manipulated your volumes. Less sets, less reps, it's that simple. We also consider any time constraints that you'll probably have balancing schoolwork and travel and fatigue, right? If you're competing weekend after weekend, we can be emptying the tank doing off-mat training that's not going to contribute to your success as a wrestler. What about homework? Man, that's really tough. So there's programming solutions in the in-season program and ways to preserve all of your off-season gains. There's also windows of opportunity here and there to tackle your strength and conditioning. I've prepared, for example, a holiday season schedule, assuming that you might be going home, spending time with your family, you're going to be off the mats for at least a week. Well, how are we going to continue to keep you fit and strong? And I've accounted for all of that. Finally, I've also provided a bunch of different options for off-mat training, different schedules to accommodate different schedules, essentially, so different templates. Here's an example of a scheduling option where you're going to do your wrestling practices in the afternoons, and you might do some lifts in the mornings. This schedule you see on top has the lift day 1 once a week because that athlete is traveling and they're competing. The second schedule you see below it, they're doing 2 lifts that week, but lift day 2 is likely much less intense and they're not competing that week. So tons of options for you to consider so that way we can accommodate your on-mat training as well as your practices and your game and competition schedule.